The Galactic Council chamber had existed for 11,000 years. It had witnessed the extinction of the Murak swarm, the silent collapse of the Dorvenic Republic, and the slow crystallization of the Synth into pure thought. It had seen empires rise and fold like tides. But in all its millennia of recorded history, it had never been this quiet. Council Elder Zephyrin O'Carth stood at the podium, her secondary eye ridge flexing involuntarily, a Veltharian reflex that those who knew her understood as deep, unguarded anxiety. She was not a being prone to anxiety. She had negotiated trade corridors through neutron star systems. She had mediated the Six-Moon War with nothing but a portable translator and 17 cups of cold fungal tea. But now her hands were trembling. The human seat was empty. Not just empty in the way a member might be late or sick or distracted by some minor political event on their homeworld. Empty in the way that communicated finality. The delegation plaque still read Earth, human species, founding signatory. The ceremonial chair still bore the scratches from when a young delegate named Priya Vasudevan had accidentally dragged it against the marble floor 40 years ago. The small secondary table beside it still held a carafe of water and a bowl of nuts that one of the human representatives had requested at every session for decades, because, as they had once explained with complete sincerity, we just like having something to snack on during the long parts. That bowl of nuts, now untouched, somehow broke something inside Zephyrin that years of interstellar conflict had failed to reach. The withdrawal notice had arrived 22 standard days ago. Short. Almost curt by the Council's standards of diplomatic communication, which typically stretched across dozens of pages of formal preamble and ritualized gratitude. The human message had been 4 paragraphs long. It thanked the Council for centuries of cooperation. It wished all member species continued prosperity. It stated, with no ambiguity and almost no elaboration, that humanity was choosing to withdraw from active Council participation indefinitely. It was signed not by any government official, but by someone named Dr. Kalan, listed simply as Senior Coordinator, Human Cooperative Assembly. Nobody at the Council had ever heard of the Human Cooperative Assembly. Its existence had not appeared in any intelligence report from any of the 12 species that maintained monitoring stations near Sol. This was, by itself, deeply alarming. We will proceed with the scheduled agenda, Zephyrin announced, because the alternative was sitting in silence staring at an empty chair, and that felt somehow worse. Elder O'Carth. The voice came from Delegate Presarial Venmock of the Thalvine Collective, a being of shimmering blue-silver flesh who occupied the third tier of seating. I must register that I cannot focus on agricultural subsidy negotiations while our founding partner species has simply vanished. They have not vanished, Zephyrin said carefully. They have withdrawn. From the Council, yes. But what does that mean for everything else? Humans operate 6 of our 17 primary trade relay stations. They maintain the only functioning medical exchange program with the Korn systems. They hold the copyright on every piece of translation software the Council uses to run these sessions. A pause. We are, at this moment, communicating through software written by humans, on hardware partially designed by humans, in a building whose emergency structural systems were retrofitted by a human engineering firm 40 years ago. Silence again. Delegate Urvash 9 of the Mechani Collective, who never spoke unless the situation warranted it, spoke. I have run preliminary projections on cascading service dependencies connected to human operations. I did not complete the projection. Why not? Someone asked. Because the projection kept expanding. Zephyrin closed all 4 of her eyes. She had served the Council for 60 years. She had watched species come and go, had seen power shift and economies collapse and ideologies burn themselves out. But she had always been able to model the situation. She could look at a crisis and find its shape, its edges, its manageable core. This had no edges. Contact the Human Cooperative Assembly, she said quietly. Whatever it is. Whoever this Kalan is. Request a dialogue session. She paused. Politely. Very politely. The assistant beside her, a young Veltharian named Tessavant who had never seen a human in person, was already working the communication console. After a moment, he looked up. The transmission has been sent, Elder. But I should note, the response came back automatically. Pre-programmed. What did it say? He read from the screen, carefully. Thank you for reaching out. Dr. Mweni is currently unavailable but will respond when possible. In the meantime, we hope your session goes well. The nuts in the bowl should still be fresh. They were restocked last week. Nobody in the chamber said anything for a long time. Then Presarial Venmock, very quietly, said, They knew we would look at the bowl. Of course they did, Zephyrin thought. They always knew. That was, perhaps, the thing the council had never properly understood. Humans paid attention to everything, every small detail, every overlooked corner, every bowl of nuts on every side table. And now they were gone. And the council was only beginning to understand how much of what it thought it had built alone had quietly, cheerfully, been maintained by a species it had never quite taken seriously enough. The session continued. The agenda moved forward. But every speaker, without exception, glanced at the empty chair before they began. As if hoping, somehow, that someone had simply been running late. Chief Medical Liaison Grethera Solis had not slept in 31 hours, which was unusual for a corn, because her species could process sleep in 12-minute intervals throughout the day and typically maintained full cognitive function indefinitely. She was not tired in the biological sense. She was tired in the way that came from staring at a problem with no bottom. The Corn Medical Exchange Station orbited a dim K-type star at the edge of Sector 44 Bravo, and it served as the primary distribution hub for what the Council colloquially called the Meridian Network, a galaxy-spanning medical supply chain that had taken 80 years to build and that currently served 41 species across 3 spiral arms. It handled everything from basic pharmaceutical synthesis to emergency surgical equipment to the genetically tailored nutrient compounds that kept the delicate Pherethi from going into cascading organ failure when exposed to certain stellar radiation bands. Humans had designed the logistics architecture. Humans ran the routing software. Humans operated the 11 relay nodes that kept the distribution timelines synchronized across light-year distances. Past tense, as of 22 days ago. "Show me the current backlog," Grethera said, and her assistant, a young corn named Velis, pulled up the holographic display with visible reluctance. The numbers were not catastrophic. Not yet. That was the insidious thing. The human teams had not simply walked away and left everything to break. Before departing, they had done something that Grethera was only now beginning to understand fully. They had left instructions. Thousands of pages of instructions. Annotated. Cross-referenced. Written in 17 languages with conversion tables for 4 more. The instructions covered every contingency anyone had bothered to ask about, and several dozen no one had thought to ask about. They covered what to do if Relay Node 3 went offline. They covered what to do if the synthesis calibrators drifted by more than 0.3%. They covered, and this was the one that had made Grethera sit down abruptly when she first read it, what to do in the event of a total system cascade failure caused by a specific type of gravitational interference that occurred once every 80 years near the K-type star. They planned for the 80-year event, she said. Velis nodded. The last one happened before this station existed. They modeled it from historical stellar data and wrote the contingency protocol 6 years ago. It is in folder 7441 of the transition documentation package. How large is the full documentation package? Velis hesitated. In printed form? Approximately the mass of a mid-sized transport vessel. Grethera stared at the backlog numbers. 17 days behind on Pherethi nutrient compounds. 9 days behind on corn immunoflux suppressants. The Thalvine emergency surgical kits were fine. Humans had pre-staged a 6-month buffer because, as the relevant documentation note read, "We noticed you tend to have political crises in the spring cycle and those usually involve injuries." They had noticed. They had staged a 6-month buffer. Without being asked. Who wrote all of this? Grethera asked. Not rhetorically, she genuinely wanted to know. Velis pulled up the author metadata. Approximately 412 individuals over 6 years. The lead coordinator was someone named Dr. Callan Mweni. A pause. That name appears on the Council's withdrawal notice as well. Grethera looked at the documentation index on her screen. Folder after folder after folder, organized with a precision that bordered on the unsettling, all of it created by people who had apparently decided, years before announcing any withdrawal, to make sure that every system they maintained would still be able to function without them. They were planning this for years, she said. At minimum 6 years, Velis confirmed. Possibly longer. The earliest preparation documents in the package are dated 9 years ago. Those ones are just assessment reports, cataloging every system humans were involved in maintaining and rating the difficulty of transitioning each one. Grethera thought about that. 9 years ago, some group of humans had quietly begun making a list of everything they were doing for the galaxy. Not to demand recognition. Not to negotiate leverage. Just to make sure that when they left, nothing would collapse. They did not want to hurt anyone, she said softly. No, Velis agreed. The introductory letter in the documentation package, the one addressed to whoever was reading it after the withdrawal, says exactly that. Would you like me to read it? Yes. Velas cleared his throat. It says, "We know this is disruptive and we are sorry for any difficulties. We have done our best to make this transition as smooth as possible. Please read the full documentation. We know it is very long. We know you will probably not read all of it. We have therefore put the most important parts in the first folder, clearly labeled 'Please read this first' in large text. We really mean it. Folder 1. Large text. Please." Grethera closed her eyes. There was something almost unbearably human about that note. The apology. The pragmatic acceptance that nobody would read the full documentation. The gentle, patient insistence that at least the important parts would be visible. "Have we read folder 1? She asked. A short pause. "We have now. You are the first." She opened her eyes. "Send it to every affected station immediately. And begin assembling a cross-species technical team to start working through the transition protocols." She stood. "And Velas, whoever this Kalanmweni is, whatever the Human Cooperative Assembly wants, I need to know. Not because we need to bring them back. They have made it very clear they can leave. I need to know because..." She looked at the backlog numbers again. At the folder tree. At the 80-year contingency plan that no one had asked for. Because I want to understand why they stayed as long as they did. Fleet Admiral Nasora Dreth of the Thalvine Rapid Response Corps had commanded warships for 40 years, and she had a rule: never assume silence was peaceful. Space was quiet by default. When something went quiet that used to make noise, that was when you started checking your weapons systems. Monitoring Station Aurelius 7 occupied a lonely orbit at the very edge of the quarantine expanse, the region of space that the Council had declared off-limits after the Dovenic incident 3 centuries ago, when an experiment in compressed dark matter had produced a region of spatial instability that still ate ships. Nobody went in. The station's job was to make sure nothing came out. For the last 200 years, human operators had staffed the monitoring rotation. Not exclusively, there were Mechany systems analysts and Veltharian astronomers and even, occasionally, a Korn xenophysics specialist. But the humans had always been there, and they had been there in disproportionate numbers, and now Nasora understood exactly why. The expanse emitted what the technical staff called ghost frequencies, irregular electromagnetic patterns that emerged from the spatial distortion and that bore, at certain intervals, an uncomfortable resemblance to communication signals. Not signals. Just patterns. The distinction was important and also, Nasora had learned, deeply contested. The human monitoring team had, over 2 centuries, developed an entire analytical framework for distinguishing genuine spatial noise from meaningful pattern emergence within the expanse. It was called the Vasudevan methodology, named for an analyst who had spent 40 years at Aurelius 7 before retiring. It was not formally published anywhere in Council scientific literature. It had been passed down, human to human, through direct training. And the last human training instructor had left the station 17 days ago. "Walk me through the current readings," Nasora said, standing at the central analysis console with Lieutenant Commander Ferathosalin, a Thalvine officer who was young and brilliant and currently wearing the expression of someone who had been staring into an abyss and was not certain it had not been staring back. "We are receiving pattern class 7 emissions from grid sectors 12 through 19, Ferath said. Under the old classification system, the Vasudevan system, a pattern class 7 at this coverage density would trigger a level 2 investigation protocol. However, he paused. However, we do not have anyone who can run the Vasudevan analysis. The methodology requires a trained interpreter. The documentation the human team left us describes the framework but notes, and I quote, "This is the part that is genuinely difficult to explain in writing and we are very sorry about that. The intuitive component takes approximately 6 months of supervised training to develop." Nasora stared at the grid readings. What does a level 2 investigation protocol entail? In practical terms, the human analysts would spend 72 hours running what they called a deep listen. Essentially, saturating the grid with passive sensors and having experienced pattern readers, humans, specifically, manually review the outputs for anything that matched their intuitive sense of meaningful variation. Their intuitive sense, Nasora repeated. Yes. The documentation is quite candid about this. It describes the skill as a combination of technical training, sleep-deprived hyperfocus, and what several of our analysts have called a feeling in the back of the neck. The documentation author, Dr. Kalanmweni again, Then adds a footnote that says we recognize this sounds unscientific and we have spent 40 years trying to formalize it and the best we have managed is the 6-month training program. We are also sorry about this. Nasora walked the length of the console slowly, looking at the grid. The expanse churned silently on the screens. It always looked like nothing. That was the point of it. That was what made it dangerous. Has anyone attempted to contact the previous human analysts? Yes. All have respectfully declined to return but have offered to conduct remote consultations within the limits of their new commitments. They cannot specify what those commitments are. The Human Cooperative Assembly. Presumably. Nasora thought. She was a military officer. She thought in terms of threats and capabilities and dependencies and gaps. She was looking at a gap right now, a 2-century-wide gap in the Council's defensive monitoring that had been filled, quietly and competently, by a species that apparently hadn't thought it was worth mentioning. Why did they never publish the Vasudevan methodology? She asked. Ferrith looked at his console. I found a correspondence archive in the station records. The original Vasudevan, the analyst the method is named for, submitted a formal publication proposal to the Council Science Directorate 40 years ago. It was returned with a note suggesting the methodology lacked sufficient empirical rigor for peer review, as it relied too heavily on qualitative human judgment. Nasora absorbed this. They were told their method was not scientific enough, she said. Yes. And they kept using it anyway. For 40 more years. And trained every human analyst who came through this station in it. And the Council continued to benefit from it while never officially acknowledging it existed. Nasora thought about the empty monitoring rotation. About the ghost frequencies. About a feeling in the back of the neck that 40 years of science funding had failed to replicate and 60 years of institutional dismissal had failed to extinguish. Initiate the remote consultation request, she said. And begin the 6-month training program with our best available personnel. Mark the expanse grid as elevated watch status. A pause. And pull whatever records we have of that rejected publication proposal. I want to know the name of every reviewer who turned it down. She looked at the ghost frequencies on the screen. Because when this is over, she said quietly, I am going to have some conversations. Senior economic analyst Corvith Lien had a reputation for precision. He had modeled the collapse of the Brentic Credit Union 3 years before it happened. He had predicted the Ferethi agricultural crisis to within 4% accuracy. He had, once, correctly forecast the exact date of a mid-size interstellar recession based on nothing but shipping data from 6 relay stations. He stared at his current model and felt, for the first time in his professional career, that he did not understand what he was looking at. Not because the data was missing. There was data. There was so much data that his modeling arrays were running at capacity. The problem was that every time he thought he had found the boundaries of humanity's economic involvement in Council space commerce, the model discovered another layer. Add the secondary shipping dependencies, he said, and his assistant Palora Sten, a junior analyst with 3 years of experience and the particular look of someone who had stopped being surprised by the surprises, added the data. The model expanded. Again. Now the tertiary intellectual property licenses. Expansion. Now the informal consulting arrangements that do not appear in the official records but show up in the payment flows. Palora paused. That last dataset is very large. I know. It suggests that humans have been operating an extensive informal consulting network throughout Council commercial space for approximately, she checked, 80 years. I know. Without registering it with any regulatory body. I know. Add it. The model expanded so dramatically that the visualization system struggled to render it. What Corvith was looking at was not, he had come to understand, a picture of human economic activity. It was a picture of the economy of the Galactic Council, and every strand of it had at some point been touched, shaped, rerouted, improved, or quietly rescued by humans who had apparently operated on the assumption that if something needed doing, you did it, and you didn't necessarily wait to be asked. The number on his screen read, in the cold language of economic projection, something that he did not want to read aloud. Estimated GDP disruption over 24 standard months assuming current trajectory, Palora said, reading over his shoulder. That cannot be right. I have run the model 6 times. But that would mean. It would mean, Corvith said carefully, that approximately a third of the commercial activity in the Council's primary economic zones is either directly operated by humans, dependent on human-maintained infrastructure, or reliant on intellectual property that humans hold the licensing rights to and that they have, for reasons I am still investigating, never enforced. Palora was quiet for a moment. Never enforced the licensing rights. Not once. Not in 80 years. The estimates suggest that if they had enforced the licensing structures they held, they would have been the wealthiest entity in the council economy by a significant margin. Why didn't they? Corvith leaned back. This was the question he kept returning to. The easy answer was incompetence. They hadn't realized what they held. But the documentation trail said otherwise. There were internal human records, now accessible through the transition packages they had left behind, that showed clear awareness of the licensing situation. Awareness and a deliberate choice to let it go, to allow the technology to be used freely, to write it off as a gift. One document I found, he said, is a memo from approximately 50 years ago. It is addressed to the Human Trade Delegation and it is from someone named Ruvain Kosi, listed as a commercial law advisor. The memo outlines the full licensing situation in detail. It is thorough and precise. He pulled it up. The final paragraph reads, "We are aware that exercising these rights would generate substantial revenue. We are also aware that we are not the only ones using these systems and that disrupting their operation would cause significant hardship to species who have come to depend on them. We therefore recommend a continuation of the current policy of non-enforcement. The goal was always to make things work. We see no reason to change that goal now." Palora sat down. They chose to just give it away. Consistently, across 8 decades, across 4 different human administrations and at least 6 major council trade renegotiations, yes. Corvith saved his model. And now they are gone and we are trying to figure out how to replace approximately 1/3 of our commercial infrastructure while also figuring out what the Human Cooperative Assembly is and why we have never heard of it. He thought about the number on his screen. About the informal consulting network. About the licensing rights that had never been enforced. They were not naive, he said. That is what I keep coming back to. The memo is not the writing of someone who does not understand the situation. They understood it exactly. They simply had a different idea of what the economy was for. He looked at the model one more time. All those threads, all those connections, all those quiet decisions made across a century by people who apparently believed that making things work was sufficient reward in itself. Begin drafting an emergency economic stabilization proposal, he said. And flag it to the council as a priority 1 assessment. He paused. And add a note that we should, when possible, find Dr. Callan Mweni and have a very long conversation. Senior archivist Moonvale Tarith had spent 900 years cataloguing the remnants of extinct civilizations. She had processed the death songs of the Murak swarm. She had indexed the final philosophical texts of the Dovenic thinkers. She had translated the last transmissions of 17 species that had, for one reason or another, gone silent. She was, by any reasonable measure, the galaxy's foremost expert on what happened when a people were no longer present. She had never expected to have to think about that skill in relation to a species that was still very much alive. The request had come from the Council via Emergency Cultural Classification Channel, a designation that was typically reserved for cases of actual species extinction or the discovery of a previously unknown sapient form. Using it for humanity's voluntary council withdrawal was, technically, a misclassification. Moonvale had noted this in her initial response and then proceeded to fulfill the request anyway, because she had looked at the request details and understood that whoever had flagged this as an emergency understood something important about the situation. The task: catalog the cultural presence of humanity within Galactic Council civilization. Not their technology. Not their economics. Their culture. The stories, art forms, social frameworks, philosophical contributions, and informal practices that humans had woven into the fabric of civilizations they had interacted with for 3 centuries. Moonvale had expected this to take several weeks. She was now on month 2 and had not yet found the bottom of the dataset. "Another batch from the Corn Cultural Exchange records," said her assistant Ferris Omel, a young species classifier with large analytical eyes and the particular gift of not being disturbed by things that should be disturbing. He placed a data chip on her desk with the careful reverence of someone delivering something significant. Medical ethics frameworks, 400 documents. All developed in consultation with human advisors. The Corn medical tradition has incorporated the human concept of patient self-determination so deeply that their own practitioners no longer identify it as external in origin. Note it. Flagged the integration depth as Category 3, indigenized, origin obscured. There is also a subsection on something called the Vasudevan Comfort Protocol. Moonvale looked up. That is not a medical term I recognize. Ferris read from the chip. It is an informal practice developed by human medical staff at the corn exchange station approximately 60 years ago. When corn patients experienced what humans identified as emotional distress, a state the corn medical tradition did not previously categorize as medically significant, human staff would sit with them in silence and offer physical proximity without requiring interaction. He paused. The corn medical literature describes it as, and I am quoting directly, inexplicably effective at stabilizing patient recovery outcomes in ways that remain physiologically unexplained. Moonvale noted it. The list continued. The Thalveen had adopted a human architectural philosophy called adaptive beauty, the idea that structures should change and age gracefully rather than resist deterioration, and had built an entire design school around it. The Ferethi had incorporated human folk music patterns into their meditation practices. The Mechani collective, beings of pure synthetic intelligence, had developed what they quietly called human logic, a reasoning mode that incorporated emotional weighting into decision trees, and used it for their most complex ethical determinations. Every species in the council had, it appeared, absorbed something from humanity. Not through formal cultural transfer programs. Not through official exchange initiatives. Through proximity, relationship, and the simple relentless human tendency to share whatever they found interesting or useful or beautiful. The Sinith contribution is the one I find most remarkable, Ferris said, pulling up another file. The Sinith were beings of distributed consciousness who communicated in mathematical abstractions. They were, by most metrics, the most alien of all council species, so different in cognitive architecture that meaningful communication had been nearly impossible for the first century of contact. The Sinith have incorporated something into their consciousness lattice that they call the human pattern, Ferris said carefully. Based on my analysis, it appears to be, I want to be precise here, an emotional resonance framework derived from direct long-term interaction with human diplomats and scientists. Essentially, through 3 centuries of attempting to understand human thought patterns, the Sinith have developed an internal emulation of human emotional reasoning, which they now use to improve their own social cognition. Moonvale was still. The Sinith, she said slowly, have grown something like human empathy. An approximation of it. Yes. The documentation describes it as their most significant cognitive development in the last 500 years, and it is directly attributed to human influence. Moonvale sat back in her chair. 900 years of cataloging what species left behind. The great tragedy of her work had always been the realization, archive after archive, that so many civilizations had not known their time was ending. Had not thought to preserve what was unique about them because uniqueness is invisible from the inside. Humanity had known. Or at least some of them had. Somewhere, this Callan Mweni and whatever the Human Cooperative Assembly was had spent years preparing a careful, thorough, considerate withdrawal. Had left documentation, and buffers, and protocols, and contingency plans. But they had not been able to document this. The things in Moonvale's archives. The comfort protocol that sat with frightened patients. The adaptive beauty design school. The Sinith learning to feel. Nobody had planned those. They had simply happened, the way good things usually happen, without announcement, in the small spaces between the official interactions, in the quiet moments when a human being sat down next to someone very different and decided, without any particular reason, to be present. How do you classify this? Ferris asked, looking at the growing archive. Moonvale thought for a long time. You do not classify it, she said finally. You just make sure you do not forget it. Tilde. Dr. Callan Mweni had not expected the request from Elder Zephyrin Kaf to come with a personal video message. Official council communications were typically text-only, formal, layered in protocol. The video was a deviation. It was 40 seconds long. Zephyrin, sitting at her desk with the council chamber visible through the window behind her, looking at the camera with all 4 eyes open, which Callan had learned from his xenoanthropology training was a Veltharian gesture of complete unguarded honesty. She said, I do not know what we did wrong. I would like to understand. We would like to do better. Please talk to us. Callan played it 3 times. Then he forwarded it to the assembly with a note that said simply, we should respond. The Human Cooperative Assembly did not have a dramatic headquarters. It occupied a converted deep space habitat that had once been a research station and that now housed approximately 400 people across 16 modules, plus several thousand more who participated remotely from locations scattered throughout and beyond council space. It looked, from the outside, like something a very practical-minded group of engineers had assembled from available parts without excessive concern for aesthetics. Inside, it felt like a school, or a library, or both at once. The Council has now sent 17 communication requests, said Lyra Osei, the Assembly's communication coordinator, a woman in her 50s with short grey hair and the permanently thoughtful expression of someone who read too much and slept not quite enough. Elder Okatha's personal message, 6 formal diplomatic channels, 2 economic emergency alerts, one from a fleet admiral named Nasora Dreth specifically about something called ghost frequency analysis, and one from an archivist on Archive World Thesivar. She paused. The archivist's message is very long and says she is building a cultural catalogue and would like to speak with someone who can explain what humanity was trying to do. That last one is the most interesting, Callan said. I thought you would say that. Callan walked to the observation port and looked out at the stars. He was 64 years old, built like someone who had spent too many hours at desks and not enough in proper gravity, with large hands that a colleague had once told him were a genetic anomaly or possibly just the result of spending 40 years typing documentation. We are not hiding, he said. It was something he said often, because it was often misunderstood. We are not punishing anyone. We are not making a political statement. The Council thinks you are, Lyra said. The Council thinks everything is a political statement. That is part of the problem. He turned from the window. The rest of the Assembly's core coordinating team was assembled in the room, 12 people of various ages, backgrounds, and species. 2 were Thalvine who had chosen to live with the Assembly, and 1 was a young Ferethi named Desavori who had come to study human social structures and had, as Callan put it, gotten distracted. They had been through this conversation before, in various forms, and they all knew the shape of it. The withdrawal was not a tantrum. It was not a negotiating tactic. It was something far simpler and more difficult to explain to beings whose entire civilizational framework was built around leverage and formal structures. Humanity had spent 3 centuries giving. Giving infrastructure, giving expertise, giving culture, giving the quiet labor of people who showed up at monitoring stations and sat with sick patients and wrote documentation packages that nobody would ever fully read. And they had given it freely, without keeping score, because that was, if you asked 100 humans to explain their species at its best, most of them would land somewhere near this, simply what you did. But 3 centuries of giving freely, invisibly, without acknowledgement or even full awareness from the recipients, had produced something that the Assembly's founders, 10 years ago, had recognized as a problem. Not in the giving itself. In what the giving was doing to humans. We were disappearing, said Myra Ashford, the Assembly's philosopher-in-residence, an elderly woman who had written the founding document and who had a habit of stating things with more bluntness than the situation strictly required. Into the infrastructure. Into the support systems. Into the maintenance work. Into every gap that needed filling. We were filling gaps so efficiently that we forgot to ask whether any of those gaps were ours to fill. The archivist's message actually understands this, Lyra said, looking at the Thesivar message again. She says, toward the end, that humanity appeared to have been present in council civilization in the way that load-bearing walls are present in architecture, essential, invisible, rarely appreciated until you try to remove them. She is not wrong, Callan said. The withdrawal was not permanent. That was the thing the council had not yet grasped, because the withdrawal letter had not said so, had been deliberately silent on the question of return, because the Assembly's founders believed that announcing a temporary absence would immediately transform it into a negotiation rather than a genuine pause. They needed to stop. To step back. To spend some years figuring out what humanity wanted, distinctly and separately from what the galaxy needed from them. To learn, and this was the part that had taken Callan the longest to articulate, how to be present for their own sake, not for the sake of the infrastructure. We should respond to Okath, Callan said. And to Dreth about the ghost frequencies, we should arrange remote consultations, we already offered those. And to the archivist. He thought. The archivist especially. Because she is asking the right question. What question is that? Asked the Savori, the young Ferethi, in her careful translated voice. Callan looked at the stars. She wants to know what we were trying to do. He paused. And the answer is not complicated. We were trying to help. We just forgot, for a while, to include ourselves among the things that needed helping. The session that changed everything lasted 11 hours and was attended, by the end of it, by representatives of 29 species, 3 independent stations, 1 Mechani collective subnode, and 2 Thalvine who had joined remotely from the Human Cooperative Assembly. It began with Elder Zephyrin Okath standing at the podium and saying something that no council elder in 11,000 years of recorded sessions had ever opened with. She said, "We owe you an apology. We would like to give it, and then we would like to listen." The apology was long. It had been drafted collaboratively, which was itself unusual. The council typically tasked a single diplomatic team, by representatives from a dozen species who had, in the weeks since the withdrawal, each independently arrived at similar realizations about similar failures. It covered the rejection of the Vasudevan methodology publication, the invisible dependency that had never been acknowledged, the licensing rights that humans had waived for 80 years without anyone formally recognizing the gift, the patients who had been sat with in silence, the monitoring rotation staffed through the small hours, the documentation written in 17 languages for contingencies nobody had asked them to plan for. It was an honest apology, which was rarer than it should have been in interstellar diplomacy. Dr. Callan Mweni, attending in person for the first time, listened to all of it without expression. He was not cold. Those who watched carefully could see that he was controlling something, and that the control was difficult. When the apology finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you. We hear you." He did not say accepted. Not yet. That distinction mattered. What followed was not a negotiation in the traditional sense. There were no concessions traded, no formal demands issued, no leverage exercised. What the assembly asked for was harder to quantify and, in several respects, more radical than anything a species had previously requested of the council. They asked to be seen accurately. This meant, concretely, a formal audit of all systems, services, and cultural contributions provided by humanity that had gone unrecorded in council literature and policy. Not for payment. Not for leverage. For record. So that the next species to fill a gap would be known to be filling it, and would not spend 3 centuries invisible inside the infrastructure of a civilization that didn't fully know they were there. They asked for the Vasudevan methodology to be formally admitted into the Council Science Directorate's official methodology library, with appropriate attribution, along with approximately 40 other analytical frameworks and practices that had been rejected over the years for similar reasons. They asked that the concept of care labor, the work of maintaining, tending, teaching, and sitting with, be formally recognized in council economic modeling as a category of value, rather than an informal transaction outside the scope of economic analysis. And they asked for something that Zephyrin had not expected and that took her some time to understand. They asked for time. Not a fixed term of re-engagement. Not a commitment to return by a specific date. Time, open-ended and genuinely respected, for the Human Cooperative Assembly to continue its internal work. The work of figuring out who they were when they weren't holding everything together for everyone else. "We will come back," Callan said, "when we are ready. Not when you need us. When we are ready. And when we do come back, it will be because we choose to be here, not because the infrastructure requires us. That is the condition." The council took 3 days to deliberate. In those 3 days, the audit began, and the numbers it produced confirmed everything that Corvith Lien's model had suggested, and then exceeded it. The cultural catalogue from Thesava arrived in full and was placed, by a unanimous procedural vote, into the Council's permanent cultural heritage archive rather than the standard species file system. Fleet Admiral Nasora Dreth personally supervised the first session of the new Ghost Frequency Training Program, taught remotely by a retired human analyst named João Ferreira who was 7 to 9 years old and had, apparently, been waiting to be asked. On the 3rd day, the Council sent its response. It was, by the standards of Council diplomacy, astonishingly brief. It said, "The conditions are accepted. Take what time you need. We will be here." Lyra Osei, reading it on the assembly station, showed it to Callan without comment. He read it twice. Then he looked up and for the first time in weeks, he smiled, not the controlled professional expression he wore in sessions, but something more real, slightly asymmetrical, the kind of smile that comes when something you were not quite sure would work has worked. "Good," he said. Far away, on Voltharian Prime, the empty human chair still stood in the council chamber. But a maintenance crew, acting on a request that had come, unofficially, from Elder Okatha's personal office, had done something small and deliberate with it. The diplomatic plaque had been updated. It still read Earth, human species, founding signatory. Beneath it, in freshly engraved text, were words that had never appeared on any diplomatic designation in 11,000 years of council history. They read, "And choosing to be here." Zephyrin looked at the chair every morning when she entered the chamber. It was still empty. It would be empty for some time yet, she understood that. But empty had a different quality now. It was not the emptiness of absence. It was the emptiness of a space being kept for someone who would, when they were ready, choose to fill it. In the small side table beside the chair, a new bowl of nuts sat waiting. Someone had thought to restock it. Nobody was quite sure who. But nobody was surprised, either.